At 14 minutes past 6 in the morning, Dr. Aria Vale looked out her bedroom window and forgot how to breathe. The street outside her quiet countryside home had turned black overnight, and it had nothing to do with the hour. Black vehicles lined every curb, filled every driveway, and blocked every road leading into her neighborhood. She counted 7 before she lost track entirely. Men in dark suits stood beside each one, perfectly still, watching her house with the patience of men who had nowhere else to be. Her coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, but she barely registered the sound. 3 nights earlier, she had pulled 2 bullets out of a stranger's body during a storm that had nearly taken out the power grid. 3 nights earlier, she had looked past the armed men crowding her tiny operating room and told herself she was simply doing her job. She had convinced herself that once the man healed, he would vanish from her life the way every stranger eventually did. Now there were close to 200 vehicles surrounding her home, and a man was walking up her front path like he owned the ground beneath his boots. He was tall, with dark hair pushed back from a sharp, unreadable face, and a tattoo curling up the side of his throat. She recognized him instantly. It was the same man whose heartbeat she had once held steady with her own 2 hands. It was the same man the underworld whispered about in tones reserved for storms and natural disasters. Lucian Drakov had come to her door, and Aria had no idea whether she was about to be protected or erased. Dr. Aria Vale had spent the better part of 4 years simply trying to survive. Her father's countryside clinic was bleeding money faster than she could patch its wounds. The equipment failed more often than it worked, and collectors called with the kind of consistency she once reserved for her morning rounds. She filled her days with routine because routine asked nothing of her grief. Every night in the quiet after the last patient left, she relived the moment her fiancé died in her arms despite every ounce of training she had to save him. She had built a life out of control, distance, and exhaustion, and it had been enough. Then a storm rolled in carrying a dying stranger to her door, and saving his life was supposed to be just another shift. Instead, it became the night that ended the only kind of peace she had left. 3 nights before 200 SUVs would surround her home, Aria was locked inside her clinic with nothing but the storm for company. Rain hammered the tin roof so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts, and the power had already flickered twice in the last hour. She had sent her assistant home before the roads flooded, which meant she was alone, restocking gauze by flashlight when she should have been asleep 3 hours ago. She heard the engines before she saw the headlights. Multiple vehicles, moving too fast for the narrow gravel road outside, tires throwing up water in sheets. Aria's pulse picked up as she crossed to the window, and what she saw made her stomach twist. 3 black SUVs had skidded to a stop outside her clinic, doors flying open before the wheels had fully settled. Men poured out into the rain, and one of them was carrying something heavy slung across his shoulders. Aria realized with a jolt that it wasn't something. It was someone. She unlocked the door before they could break it down, mostly because she didn't want to pay for a new one. "This is a medical clinic, not a war zone," she said, stepping back as 4 soaked men pushed inside, water pooling instantly on her clean floor. "Put him on the table. Now." Man on the table was barely conscious, his shirt soaked through with rain and something darker. Aria's training took over before fear had the chance to. She cut away the fabric and found 2 entry wounds, one high on his shoulder and one low on his side, both bleeding steadily. "Gunshot wounds," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Who did this?" "That's not your concern," one of the men answered. He had positioned himself by the door like he intended to grow roots there. "Just keep him alive." "Intend to, but I need information, not threats." Aria pressed gauze hard against the lower wound and looked up at the man hovering closest. "Has he lost consciousness at any point tonight?" "Twice," the man said. "Maybe 3 times. "Helpful," Aria muttered, reaching for her suture kit with hands that had gone perfectly steady, the way they always did once the work began. Fear was a luxury she allowed herself only after the bleeding stopped. The wounded man's eyes opened halfway, dark and unfocused, fixing on her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle through a fog. "You're not afraid," he said, voice rough as gravel dragged over stone. "I'm terrified," Aria admitted, threading a needle without looking away from the wound. "I'm just better at hiding it than you are at hiding bullet holes." Something flickered across his face that might have been amusement if he'd had the strength for it. "Apparently I'm not very good at it." "You really aren't." She worked quickly, clamping the bleeder near his ribs before it could cost him more blood than he had to spare. "Lie still. The bullet in your side nicked something it shouldn't have, and I need both hands free. If I don't lie still, then you'll bleed out on a table that's seen better decades, and I'll have spent my evening for nothing." She finally glanced at the men crowding her tiny room, all of them watching her like she might be the dangerous one. "I need space and quiet, not an audience." Nobody moved. "Now would be good," Aria said, sharper this time, and something in her tone finally worked because the men retreated toward the waiting area, leaving the door cracked just enough to keep watch. For the next 40 minutes, Aria worked in near silence, broken only by the storm outside and the occasional ragged breath from her patient. She extracted the first bullet with more luck than precision, found the second lodged dangerously close to his kidney, and spent 10 tense minutes convincing herself she wouldn't lose him on her own operating table. When she finally closed the last incision, his blood pressure had stabilized, and his breathing had steadied into something resembling sleep. Aria peeled off her gloves and allowed herself one slow exhale, the kind she usually saved for after losing a patient rather than saving one. It was only then, wiping the last of the blood from her hands, that she noticed the tattoo curling along his collarbone and the scars layered over older scars, a map of violence written across skin that didn't belong to an ordinary man. Whoever he was, Aria had a feeling she had just stitched herself into something far bigger than a stormy night and 2 bullet wounds. She had no idea yet how right she was. 3 days after the storm, Aria had almost convinced herself the wounded stranger was a closed chapter. He had left her clinic before dawn, carried out by the same silent men who brought him in, with nothing but a folded stack of cash and a curt thank you left on her counter. She told herself that was the end of it. She was wrong, and the proof of it was currently parked outside her bedroom window in the form of 200 black vehicles. Aria's coffee mug hit the floor and exploded into pieces she didn't bother looking at. Her hands found the windowsill instead, knuckles white, eyes scanning street after street of identical SUVs and identical men standing beside them. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a staging ground for an invasion. "This isn't happening," she whispered, though the words did nothing to make the vehicles disappear from her driveway, her neighbors' lawns, and every visible inch of road beyond. She spotted him before she fully processed what she was looking at. A tall figure in a black coat walked up her front path with the calm of a man strolling through his own garden rather than someone surrounded by an army. Dark hair, sharp jaw, a tattoo curling along his throat exactly where she remembered stitching the skin beside it. Lucian Drakov was alive, upright, and somehow more unsettling, fully healed than he had been bleeding out on her exam table. Aria yanked open her front door before he could knock, mostly because she refused to let 200 strangers watch her hesitate. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why my street looks like a funeral procession for the entire city." "I come in first?" Lucian's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Absolutely not. Start talking." He studied her for a moment, the same way he had the night she dug bullets out of his side, like he was recalculating something. "3 nights ago, you saved my life. Word of that has reached people who should never have learned it." "What people?" "Enemies who have spent years trying to put me in the ground." He glanced briefly down the street at the rows of dark vehicles, his expression unreadable. "When they discovered I survived an attack that should have killed me, they started looking for whoever stitched me back together. It didn't take them long to find you." Aria's stomach dropped somewhere near her shoes. "So you brought an army to my house to warn me that other people might come for me with their own army." "I brought protection," Lucian corrected, "because the alternative was leaving you exposed while my enemies decided how valuable you'd become to them." "How valuable is that?" "Exactly. Valuable enough that they would use you as leverage against me without hesitation." He said it plainly, no performance, no softening. "Valuable enough that your clinic, your employees, and everyone who works beside you suddenly matter to people who don't care who gets hurt collecting on a debt." Aria felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she refused to let it show. "I patched up a stranger during a storm. I didn't sign up to become collateral in somebody else's war." Lucian agreed quietly. "You didn't, but you are now, whether either of us wanted it." She crossed her arms, partly to keep her hands from shaking. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with that information?" "Come with me," he said, "where I can actually keep you alive." "That's not a request you get to make," he admitted, something almost like respect flickering behind his expression. But it's the only one that ends with you breathing tomorrow. Aria glanced past him at the wall of vehicles and the men standing beside them, all waiting on a word from a man who apparently didn't raise his voice when he gave orders. She thought of her father's clinic, the debts piling on her desk, and the quiet, controlled life she had built specifically so nothing like this could ever happen again. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "I want answers. Real ones, not the kind men like you usually give." Something shifted in Lucian's eyes, faint but unmistakable. "You'll get them." Aria didn't trust him, not entirely, but she trusted the 200 reasons currently parked outside her house even less. She stepped past him into a war she hadn't started and had no idea how to survive. The drive to Lucian's estate took almost an hour, most of which Aria spent watching the convoy thin out behind them as vehicles peeled away to cover other routes. By the time they reached the gates, only a dozen SUVs remained, which still felt like 11 too many for what was supposed to be a simple ride. The estate itself looked less like a home and more like a small, well-armed nation. Stone walls rose higher than anything Aria had seen outside of old fortresses in textbooks, with cameras mounted every few feet and men patrolling the grounds in patterns too precise to be casual. "You weren't exaggerating about the enemies," Aria said, stepping out of the vehicle and craning her neck up at the main house. "I never exaggerate," Lucian replied. "It wastes time, and I don't have much of it to spare." Inside, the house was colder than she expected, all clean lines and quiet rooms that looked rarely lived in. A woman in scrubs met them at the door, introducing herself briskly as part of Lucian's private medical staff before leading them toward a wing Aria assumed was reserved for exactly this kind of situation. "He's been favoring his left side since this morning," the woman said, handing Aria a folder of notes. "Elevated temperature, too. We were hoping you might take a look, given that you're already familiar with the wound." Aria raised an eyebrow at Lucian. "You have an entire medical staff and you still need me." "They're competent," Lucian said, settling onto the edge of a bed that looked far too fine for someone constantly getting shot. "You're the one who actually fixed me. That's not how medicine works." "Maybe not, but it's how trust works." Aria examined the wound site carefully, frowning at the warmth radiating from the skin around his lower stitches. "This is inflamed, and not in a way I like." She pressed gently, watching his jaw tighten. "Have you been resting like I assume your very expensive doctors told you to?" "I run an organization that doesn't pause for stitches." "Then your organization is about to run itself straight into a funeral." She reached for supplies the staff had already laid out, clearly anticipating exactly this outcome. "You're lucky it's irritation and not infection, but only barely." "Comforting," Lucian said dryly. "I wasn't trying to comfort you. I was trying to keep you breathing." She cleaned the site, working with the same brisk efficiency she'd shown back at her clinic. "You do understand that ignoring a wound this severe could undo every hour I spent keeping you alive." "Aware." "Then start acting like it." She glanced up briefly. "Because next time I might not be in the building to fix your mistakes." Something flickered across his face, there and gone, almost like surprise that someone in his own house dared speak to him that plainly. "Most people don't talk to me this way. People are probably too afraid of you to give you good medical advice." She taped fresh gauze into place and stepped back. "I'm apparently too tired for that kind of fear today." The first time since she'd met him, something close to a real laugh escaped him, low and brief, like he wasn't entirely used to the sound himself. Before either of them could say more, a man stepped into the doorway, dressed in a suit instead of armed gear, his expression unreadable but urgent. "Sir, we need to speak." Lucian's easy posture vanished instantly, replaced by something sharper. "What is it?" "Not here," the man said, glancing briefly at Aria. Lucian rose, careful of his side, and turned to her with a calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Stay close to the staff until I'm back." "Define close," Aria said, though her stomach had already tightened at the shift in the room. He didn't answer, and the door closed behind him with a finality that left her standing alone in a fortress full of armed strangers. If you're enjoying how deep this story is unfolding, take a second to like this video. Drop a comment telling us what you think happens next. Share it with someone who loves a good Mafia romance, and subscribe so you don't miss what's waiting behind that door. Because whatever news had just walked through it, Aria had a feeling it was about to change everything. The man who had pulled Lucian away introduced himself simply as Dimitri, head of security, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries when he led Lucian into the study down the hall. "We found surveillance equipment near Dr. Vale's clinic," Dimitri said. spreading photographs across the desk. Hidden cameras, 2 of them, positioned to catch anyone entering or leaving the building. Lucian picked up one of the images, jaw tightening as he studied the angle. How long have they been there? Based on the dust accumulation, at least 4 days, possibly longer. Dimitri's voice stayed clipped and professional, though his eyes betrayed how seriously he took the discovery. Someone has been watching her clinic since before the storm that brought you to her door. That's not possible. Nobody knew I was going there that night. Apparently someone did, Dimitri said. Or someone got lucky enough to notice your convoy afterward and started asking questions in the right places. Lucian set the photograph down slowly. Marchetti. That's my assumption as well. Dimitri pulled out another folder, this one thinner. There's more. One of our contacts intercepted communication an hour ago. The Marchetti family has placed a bounty on Dr. Vale, a significant one. Room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence usually did. How significant? Significant enough that half the freelance crews in the city are already asking around about her schedule. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, the kind of stillness that came right before violence rather than calm. Where is she now? With the medical staff, as instructed. Keep 2 men on her at all times, inside the house, not just patrolling the grounds. The hall, Aria had no idea any of this conversation was happening, though she felt the tension the moment Lucian returned, his expression carefully arranged into something calmer than what Dimitri's face had shown moments earlier. Everything all right? She asked, setting down the chart she'd been reviewing for one of the staff. Routine business, Lucian said. A terrible liar for someone who runs an empire built on secrets. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, before settling back into something more guarded. There's been a development. Someone placed a price on your safety, and not the kind that ends well if collected. Aria's hands stilled. Define price. The kind that motivates dangerous people to take dangerous risks. He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. You won't be returning to the clinic until this is resolved. My patients will be cared for by your staff, who I've already arranged additional protection for. His tone left no room for negotiation. Your life matters more right now than your schedule. Aria wanted to argue, but the words died somewhere in her throat when raised voices erupted from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of a scuffle against gravel. Lucian moved fast for a man with stitches still healing, crossing the room and pulling Aria behind him before she fully registered what was happening. Dimitri burst through the door seconds later, breathing hard. Men tried to scale the east wall, he said. We caught them before they reached the house, but they had photographs of Dr. Vale in their possession. Aria's stomach turned cold. Photographs of me, taken outside your clinic, Dimitri confirmed. They knew exactly where to find you and exactly what you looked like. That's not surveillance anymore, Lucian said quietly. That's an active operation. What happens to the men you caught? Aria asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Tell us everything they know, Lucian said, and then they'll regret ever taking this job. Aria swallowed hard, the reality of her situation finally settling somewhere she couldn't reason her way out of. This isn't a misunderstanding anymore, is it? No, Lucian said, his voice low but steady, the kind of steady meant to anchor someone rather than comfort them. You're not just a witness to what happened to me anymore. You're a target, and from this point forward, I intend to make sure nobody gets close enough to collect on it. Aria looked at him, searching his face for the reassurance his words were supposed to carry, and found something far more unsettling instead. He meant every syllable of it, and somehow that frightened her more than the bounty itself. 2 days passed inside the estate without another incident, though the quiet felt more like a held breath than actual peace. Aria spent her mornings checking on Lucian's recovery and her afternoons packing rooms too large for the restlessness building inside her. She found him in his study that evening, a folder open on his desk that he closed the moment she walked in, though not quickly enough. What is that? She asked, nodding toward the folder. Nothing that concerns you. It had my name on it, so it concerns me. Aria crossed her arms, waiting him out the way she waited out patients who lied about their symptoms. Lucian exhaled slowly, the closest thing to defeat she'd seen from him. I had my people look into your background. Standard procedure when someone enters this house. Standard procedure, Aria repeated flatly. So you know everything now. I know enough. He slid the folder slightly toward her, though he didn't open it again. I know about the clinic's debt, the collectors, the equipment that keeps failing because you can't afford to replace it. And And I know about David. Him hit harder than she expected, landing somewhere just beneath her ribs. You had no right to dig into that. You're right, I didn't, Lucian said, voice quieter than before. But I needed to understand who I was protecting, and that meant understanding what built you. Aria sat down across from him, suddenly too tired to keep arguing. He was my fiancé. We were supposed to get married that spring. She stared at her hands, the same hands that had stitched Lucian's wounds without hesitation. There was a hostage situation at a convenience store. Wrong place, wrong time. I was a trauma surgeon, supposedly skilled enough to save anyone, and I couldn't save him. That wasn't your failure. That to the 4 years I've spent proving otherwise. Her voice cracked slightly, though she refused to let it break completely. I left the hospital because I couldn't stand the way people looked at me afterward, like I was supposed to have some kind of answer for why training and skill weren't enough that day. Lucian watched her with an intensity that felt different from the calculating look he usually wore, something closer to recognition. Grief doesn't follow logic. It doesn't care how skilled you are. You sound like you understand that better than most people would. Buried more people than I can count, he said simply. None of them got easier because I understood why they died. Aria studied him for a long moment, surprised by how much that admission cost him to say. So that's why you have a folder full of my failures. Curiosity about grief. Not curiosity, he said. Necessity. The clinic you're drowning in debt for is the same clinic enemies now know how to find. I needed to know what mattered to you so I could protect it properly. You could have just asked me. Would you have told me? Aria opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again because the honest answer was no. I don't let people in easily. It tends to end badly. I noticed, Lucian said, something almost gentle creeping into his tone. You've built an entire life around making sure nobody gets close enough to hurt you again. You've built an entire empire doing exactly the same thing. That earned the faintest flicker of a smile. Maybe we have more in common than either of us expected. Aria stood, suddenly needing distance from how easily he'd read her, how thoroughly he'd already woven himself into corners of her life she usually kept locked. Just because you know my secrets doesn't mean you understand me, Lucian agreed, rising as well. But it's a start. She left the study without responding, though the words followed her down the hallway, settling somewhere she wasn't ready to examine yet. For a man the underworld feared, Lucian Drakov had just become the first person in years to see her clearly, and that terrified her more than any bounty ever could. It was well past midnight when Aria knocked on Lucian's door, chart in hand and sleep nowhere in sight for either of them. His fever had spiked slightly that afternoon, enough to justify another check before she'd allow herself to rest. You don't have to do this yourself, Lucian said as she stepped inside, sitting up against the headboard with the wary alertness of a man who never fully relaxed. I have staff for this. Your staff already went to bed, unlike some people who apparently think sleep is optional. She set her bag down and reached for his wrist, checking his pulse with the same brisk efficiency she always used to hide how aware she was of him. How does your side feel? Sore, manageable. That's not an answer, that's a deflection. She pressed gently along his ribs, watching his face for the flinch he tried to hide. There it is. You enjoy proving me wrong. Enjoy keeping you alive. Proving you wrong is just a side effect. She finished her examination and sat on the edge of a nearby chair instead of leaving immediately, something keeping her there longer than medically necessary. Can I ask you something? You usually do anyway. The scars, she said carefully. Not the new ones. The old ones, layered over each other like you've been collecting them for years. Lucian's expression shifted, the easy deflection from before replaced by something heavier. My father ran this organization before me. When I was 16, a rival family decided the fastest way to weaken him was to remove his heir. They came after you. They came after my entire family. His voice stayed level, though something underneath it had gone cold. My mother didn't survive that night. Neither did my younger sister. I lived because I was hiding in a place no 16-year-old should have known to hide in, and I've spent every year since making sure nobody catches me unprepared again. Aria sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of what he'd just handed her. That's why you trust almost nobody. Trust gets people killed in my world. I learned that lesson early. Yet you let me into your house, your business, your wounds. She studied him carefully. Why? Because you didn't ask for any of this, he said simply. You stitched a stranger back together during a storm and asked for nothing in return except answers. That's rarer than you realize. Something about his honesty loosened something in her chest that had stayed tightly wounded for years. David asked me to marry him in a coffee shop. Nothing dramatic, no elaborate plan. He just looked at me over 2 cups of coffee and asked, and I said yes before he finished the question. What happened? Wrong place, wrong time, like I told you. A man with a gun and nothing left to lose walked into a convenience store while David was buying coffee creamer, of all things. Her voice wavered slightly, though she pushed through it. By the time I got to him, he'd already lost too much blood. I worked on him in the ambulance, in the trauma bay, anywhere I could, and none of it mattered. That wasn't a failure of skill. Felt like one. I had spent years training to save people, and the one person I needed to save the most, I couldn't. She met his eyes, surprised by how steady her voice had become despite the subject. I've been hiding from that feeling for 4 years. Hiding doesn't make grief smaller, Lucian said quietly. It just makes it heavier to carry. You'd know. Would. They sat in silence for a long moment, 2 people who had spent years building walls now finding themselves oddly exposed in front of each other. Aria finally rose, gathering her bag with hands that felt steadier than they had in years. Get some rest, she said softly. Doctor's orders. Stay, Lucian said, the word slipping out before he seemed to fully decide on it. Aria paused at the door, heart caught somewhere between caution and an emotion she hadn't let herself feel in far too long. She didn't leave. Aria woke the next morning still in the chair beside Lucian's bed, neck stiff and conscience slightly guilty for falling asleep on duty, even if the only patient present had insisted on it. Lucian was already awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. You stayed, he said. You asked, she replied, stretching out the kink in her neck. Doesn't mean I planned on falling asleep in a chair like a malfunctioning night nurse. You looked peaceful, looked unconscious. There's a difference. She stood, smoothing down her wrinkled clothes. How's the pain this morning? Tolerable. He studied her a moment longer before changing the subject entirely. There's something I want to show you. It concerning, because I've had enough concerning revelations this week to last several lifetimes. It's personal, he said, not dangerous. Curiosity won out over caution, and 20 minutes later, Aria found herself standing in front of a door at the far end of the estate that looked untouched compared to the rest of the house. Lucian unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, one she hadn't noticed before despite spending considerable time near him. This was my father's study, he said, stepping inside. Nobody's touched it since he died. Room looked frozen in time, heavy wooden furniture, shelves lined with books that had collected years of dust, and a desk that still held papers exactly where someone had left them decades ago. Aria moved carefully, aware she was standing inside a memory rather than just a room. Show me this now, because you asked about my scars, and I gave you half the story. Lucian ran his fingers along the edge of the desk. My father built this organization from nothing, through ports and shipping routes that legitimate businesses couldn't touch. He believed loyalty was the foundation of everything. What happened to that belief? His most trusted advisor sold him out to a rival family for a fraction of what loyalty should have been worth. Lucian's voice stayed even, though his jaw tightened. That betrayal is what led to the attack that killed my mother and sister. My father trusted the wrong man, and it cost him everything he loved. Aria absorbed that slowly. Did your father survive that night? Long enough to make sure I understood exactly who was responsible, Lucian said. He died 3 days later from injuries he never told anyone the full extent of. He spent his last conscious hours teaching me everything I needed to know to survive what was coming. That's an enormous burden to hand a 16-year-old. Was the only inheritance he had left to give. Lucian picked up a photograph from the desk, weathered at the edges, and handed it to her. A younger version of him stood beside a man who shared his sharp jaw and a woman with a gentle smile, a young girl laughing between them. That was the last photograph taken of all of us together. Aria studied the image carefully, seeing the family Lucian had lost rather than the empire he'd built from the wreckage. You built all of this because of one betrayal. I built all of this because betrayal taught me that power is the only language some people respect. He took the photograph back gently, setting it down exactly where it had been. I became what I needed to become so nobody could ever do to me what was done to my family. Has it worked? Has any of this protected you the way you hoped it would? Lucian was quiet for a long moment, his usual composure slipping just slightly. It kept me alive. It didn't make me whole. Aria looked around the untouched study, understanding now why he'd kept it sealed away rather than facing it daily. "Thank you for showing me this. Don't show this room to anyone." "Then why me?" "Because somehow, in less than a week, you've become someone I trust enough to let inside the one room I've spent years avoiding myself." Lucian met her eyes, vulnerability flickering openly across features the underworld had only ever seen as fearsome. "I don't fully understand it, but I'm done pretending it isn't true." Aria felt something shift inside her chest, dangerous and warm all at once. The kind of feeling she had spent 4 years convincing herself she'd never allow again. The discovery came from something small, almost forgettable, the kind of detail that meant nothing until it meant everything. Dimitri found Lucian in the garden 2 days later, a tablet in his hand and an expression that promised bad news before he said a single word. "We have a problem," Dimitri said. "We've had several this week. Be specific." "Marcus." Lucian's expression didn't change, though something behind his eyes went sharp and still. Marcus had served as his second in command for nearly 6 years, present at nearly every major decision the organization had made since Lucian took over. "What about him?" "Financial records," Dimitri said, handing over the tablet. "Buried under shell companies, but the pattern is clear once you know what you're looking for. Marcus has been receiving payments from accounts linked to the Marchetti family for the past 8 months. Lucian scrolled through the figures slowly, each transaction landing like a separate blow. 8 months! Least. There could be more we haven't traced yet. How did the surveillance equipment end up near Aria's clinic? Marcus had access to the convoy logs from that night, Dimitri said grimly. He knew exactly where you went after the attack, and he knew exactly who treated you. Something cold settled into Lucian's chest, colder than anger, closer to betrayal sharpened into focus. He sold her location. It appears that way. Lucian found Marcus exactly where he expected, reviewing security rotations in the East Wing like nothing in his world had shifted. Marcus looked up as Lucian entered, offering the same easy smile he always wore. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked. "That depends entirely on what you tell me next." Lucian set the tablet down on the desk between them, watching closely as Marcus's eyes scanned the figures, and his expression cracked just slightly before composing itself again. "I can explain." "You can try," Marcus exhaled slowly, the smile finally dropping away completely. "The Marchetti family approached me months ago. They offered enough money to disappear comfortably, far away from this life entirely. I told myself I'd give them nothing important. Then you gave them my location the night I was shot." "I didn't know they'd use it that way," Marcus said, though the excuse sounded thin even to him. "I thought it was just information, nothing actionable." "You handed them a wounded man's location during the most vulnerable night of his life," Lucian said, voice dangerously calm. "And when that wasn't enough, you handed them the woman who saved that life. Never meant for it to go this far. It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did." Lucian's hands remained still at his sides, though the stillness felt more threatening than any raised voice could have. "My mother and sister died because someone my father trusted decided his loyalty had a price. I built this entire organization to make sure that never happened again. Lucian, you don't get to use my name right now." Lucian's voice finally sharpened, cutting through whatever apology Marcus was preparing to offer. 8 months, Marcus. 8 months of selling pieces of this organization to people who want me dead." Dimitri stepped forward, flanked by 2 additional men who had clearly been waiting for exactly this signal. Marcus didn't resist as they restrained him, his expression resigned rather than surprised. "What happens now?" Marcus asked quietly. "Now you tell us everything you've given them," Lucian said. "Every detail, every contact, every piece of information that's currently sitting in enemy hands. After that, the consequences will match exactly what you've earned." As they led Marcus away, Aria appeared in the doorway, having clearly heard enough to understand the shape of what just happened. "Is everyone all right?" "No," Lucian admitted, the first honest answer he'd given all morning. "Someone I trusted for 6 years just confirmed he's been working against me, and now I have to assume every plan we've made since that night is compromised, including the security around me. Especially the security around you." Lucian turned to face her fully, jaw tight with restrained fury. "Marcus knew where you were staying, knew your schedule, and likely passed all of it directly to the people hunting you." Aria felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, the safety she'd been cautiously building suddenly fractured by betrayal she hadn't seen coming. "Then they already know exactly where I am," Lucian said grimly, And that means we're no longer simply waiting for an attack. We're already inside one. First safe house burned that same night, and Aria heard about it the way she heard most things now, through hushed voices in hallways and Lucian's expression growing harder with each passing hour. Bad? She asked, finding him in the command room where maps and screens had replaced any pretense of normal living. Men inside. None of them made it out. Lucian's eyes stayed fixed on a screen showing security footage from across the city, smoke rising against a dark skyline. The Marchetti family didn't waste any time once Marcus's information reached them. What does this mean for us? It means whatever fragile peace existed before is officially over. Dimitri answered before Lucian could, his own expression grim as he pulled up another feed. They've hit 2 of our shipping warehouses in the last hour. We're already counting casualties. Aria's stomach tightened at the word casualties, the clinical detachment of it failing to soften what it actually meant. People are dying because of information Marcus sold. People are dying because the Marchetti family has wanted this war for years, Lucian corrected. Marcus simply gave them the opening they'd been waiting for. A man burst through the doors before anyone could respond further, breathless and urgent. Sir, they've hit the docks. We're losing the Western warehouse completely. Lucian was moving before the man finished speaking, grabbing his jacket from a nearby chair. Get every available man to the docks. I want this contained before it spreads to the residential blocks nearby. You're going yourself? Aria asked, already knowing the answer before he gave it. I built this organization. I'm not going to watch it burn from a screen. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. Lucian's tone left no room for negotiation. The same authority she'd heard him use on his own men now directed fully at her. You're the reason half this war exists. I'm not walking you directly into the middle of it. I'm a trauma surgeon, Lucian. If your men are getting hurt, I can actually help them. He hesitated, torn between the danger and the practical truth of what she offered. If you come, you stay inside the perimeter my men establish. No exceptions. Fine. The docks were chaos by the time they arrived, flames licking up the side of a warehouse while men shouted orders and return fire echoed across the waterfront. Aria's training took over the moment she saw the first injured man pulled from the wreckage, her hands moving with practiced calm even as the world around her descended into noise and smoke. Pressure here now, she instructed one of Lucian's men, guiding his hands to a wound on a fallen soldier's leg while she worked on stabilizing his breathing. Keep him talking if you can. I need him conscious. The chaos, she caught glimpses of Lucian directing his men with the same calm authority he carried everywhere, though tonight it was edged with something rower, more desperate. He fought like a man who had buried too many people already and refused to bury more tonight. An explosion rocked the eastern side of the warehouse, sending several men staggering as debris rained down. Aria ducked instinctively, shielding the patient beneath her with her own body until the worst of it passed. You all right? Lucian's voice cut through the noise as he reached her, checking her over with hands that shook slightly despite his composed expression. I'm fine. Keep moving. Your men need you more than I do right now. He hesitated only a second before nodding, disappearing back into the chaos with renewed urgency. Aria turned back to her patient, pressing harder against the wound as sirens began wailing somewhere in the distance, far too late to matter for the warehouse already collapsing into ash. By the time the fires finally died down hours later, Lucian's organization had lost more than buildings. They had lost men, resources, and the illusion that this war could be contained quietly. Standing amid the wreckage, covered in soot and someone else's blood, Aria realized the gentle world she'd built around careful routines and quiet isolation was gone completely. There was no controlling what came next. There was only surviving it. It happened on the drive back from the docks, when exhaustion had loosened everyone's guard just enough for it to matter. Aria remembered the screech of tires, the sudden jolt as their vehicle was forced off the road, and very little after that beyond a sharp pain at the back of her skull and darkness swallowing everything whole. She woke up in a room with concrete walls and a single bulb swinging overhead, her wrists bound to a chair that had clearly seen this exact purpose before. Her head throbbed in time with her pulse, and for a moment, panic threatened to take over completely. She forced it down the way she always did with fear, by focusing on something useful instead. The door opened, and a man stepped inside, well-dressed despite the grim surroundings, his smile carrying none of the warmth it pretended to offer. Dr. Vale, I apologize for the unconventional accommodations. Where am I? Somewhere Lucian Drakov will spend considerable time looking for you, the man said. I'm Vincenzo Marchetti, though I imagine you've heard plenty about my family by now. Heard you burn warehouses and kill men who never had a chance to fight back. Vincenzo's smile sharpened slightly. War requires sacrifices, Dr. Vale. You've simply become one of them. Not a sacrifice. I'm a doctor who stitched up a stranger during a storm. In doing so, you became the single most valuable piece on this particular board. He circled her slowly, the way predators circled prey, deciding whether the chase was worth the effort. Lucian values very few things in this world. Apparently, you've become one of them. Aria kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly hunting for. What do you want from me? Nothing, actually. I simply want Lucian to know exactly where to find you, and exactly what it will cost him to get you back. Vincenzo nodded toward someone outside the door. Make sure the message reaches him quickly. After he left, Aria assessed her situation with the same clinical focus she used during surgery, cataloging details instead of panicking over them. The rope binding her wrists had been tied competently, but not expertly, loose enough that patients might eventually work it free. The single guard stationed outside her door coughed every few minutes, the wet, persistent cough of someone fighting an infection rather than simply clearing his throat. When the guard finally entered hours later to check on her, Aria seized the opportunity immediately. Your cough sounds bad. How long have you had it? The guard eyed her warily. Why do you care? Because untreated bronchitis turns into pneumonia faster than people realize, and pneumonia kills more people than bullets in this line of work. She kept her voice calm, professional, the same tone she used to coax nervous patients into trusting her. I could tell you what symptoms to watch for if you're interested. He hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and the nagging worry she'd just planted. You're trying to manipulate me. I'm trying to keep you from coughing up blood in a few weeks, Aria said simply. Whether you listen is entirely up to you. Over the following hours, she chipped away at his guard piece by piece, offering genuine medical advice mixed with careful observations about the building, the number of men stationed nearby, and the schedule of guard rotations. He never fully trusted her, but he talked more than he should have, and every word gave her something to work with. By the time Lucian's men breached the building 2 days later, Aria had already loosened her restraints enough to slip free the moment chaos erupted outside her door. She used the confusion to her advantage, slipping past distracted guards and finding a narrow service corridor that led toward the sound of gunfire rather than away from it, because gunfire meant Lucian, and Lucian meant rescue. She found him exactly where instinct told her he'd be, fighting through the last line of resistance with single-minded focus. He spotted her the moment she emerged from the shadows, and something in his expression cracked open entirely. Aria. I'm here, she said, voice steadier than she expected. I'm all right. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, hands checking her over with barely controlled urgency before pulling her against him like he needed to confirm she was real. They took you because of me, he said quietly. They took me because they're afraid of what we've become together, Aria corrected. And clearly, they should be more afraid than they realized. By the time Aria's wounds had been cleaned, and her statement taken about everything she'd overheard during her captivity, Lucian had already begun assembling the largest force his organization had mobilized in years. Vincenzo made a mistake taking you, he told her, packing the command room while maps of the Marchetti family's main compound covered every available surface. He wanted to prove a point, and instead he handed us exactly the location we needed. What location? The guard you spoke to mentioned rotations centered around a specific building, Dimitri said, pointing to a structure on the map. Combined with what our other sources have gathered, we believe that's where Vincenzo and his core leadership are currently stationed. You're going after all of them at once, Aria said, understanding the scale of what was forming around her. This ends tonight, Lucian said, voice carrying the same finality she'd heard the night he first walked through her clinic doors. Every warehouse they've burned, every man they've killed, every threat they've made against you, it all gets settled tonight. Many men are you bringing? Enough, Dimitri answered for him. More than they'll expect, positioned in ways they won't anticipate. Aria watched Lucian check his weapon with the same careful precision she used checking surgical instruments before an operation. Let me come. The answer came immediately, sharper than before. You've already been taken once because of this war. I'm not risking that again. I'm not asking to fight, Lucian. I'm asking to be close enough to help when this is over because it will require help, and you know that. He studied her for a long moment, torn between protective instinct and practical necessity. You stay in the secondary vehicle, behind every line of defense we establish. No closer. Understood. Compound looked deceptively quiet when they arrived hours later, the kind of stillness that preceded violence rather than peace. Lucian's men moved with practiced precision, surrounding the building from angles Vincenzo's forces clearly hadn't anticipated. The first shots rang out within minutes, and the night dissolved into chaos that Aria monitored from the relative safety of the vehicle, every distant gunshot tightening something in her chest she refused to name. Inside the compound, Lucian moved through hallways with controlled fury, men falling before him as he pushed deeper toward the room where Dimitri's intelligence promised Vincenzo would be waiting. He found him exactly there, standing amid the wreckage of a war he'd started but clearly hadn't expected to lose. "You actually came yourself," Vincenzo said, almost amused despite the chaos surrounding them both. "I expected you to send men and watch from somewhere safe." "Don't hide from things I'm responsible for," Lucian said. "Something you might have learned if your family had any honor left to teach you. Honor is a luxury for people who can afford it." Vincenzo's hand drifted toward a weapon at his side, though he made no move to draw it yet. "You took everything from my family years ago. This was simply balance restoring itself. My father never touched your family until your people murdered mine first." Lucian's voice stayed level despite the fury underneath it. "You don't get to rewrite history just because the ending doesn't favor you. History is written by whoever survives to tell it. Then let's see who survives tonight." What followed happened faster than either man seemed to expect, a blur of motion that ended with Vincenzo on the ground and Lucian standing over him, breathing hard but steady, the war finally settling into something resembling its conclusion. "This doesn't end with my death," Vincenzo said, blood pooling beneath him. "Someone always rises to continue what we started." "Maybe," Lucian said quietly. "But it won't be you, and it won't be tonight." By the time the sun rose over the compound, the Marchetti family's leadership had been dismantled completely, their organization scattered and broken beyond any meaningful recovery. Lucian emerged from the wreckage to find Aria already moving toward him, ignoring every instruction about staying back the moment she saw him standing. "It's over," he said simply. "Truly over. Truly over." He pulled her against him despite the blood and exhaustion clinging to them both, finally allowing himself the relief he'd held back through every dangerous hour of the night. "Nobody's hunting you anymore." Aria closed her eyes against his chest, listening to a heartbeat she'd once fought desperately to keep steady, now finally beating in a world that no longer threatened to take it away. 3 weeks passed before Aria finally stepped back inside her own house, and the silence there felt different than before, less like isolation and more like a pause waiting to be filled. The clinic had reopened with proper funding quietly arranged through channels she suspected led straight back to Lucian, though he never claimed credit for it directly. She had spent those weeks splitting her time between her patients and his estate, neither fully choosing one life over the other, until this morning, when he told her something had finally settled enough to give her a real decision. "Want you to have an actual choice," Lucian had said that morning, standing in her kitchen like he belonged there despite everything separating their worlds. "Not one made under threat or obligation, but one made because it's genuinely what you want." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm giving you your freedom completely. No guards stationed outside your clinic unless you ask for them. No expectations tying you to my world unless you choose to stay in it." His expression had stayed carefully controlled, though something vulnerable flickered beneath the surface. "I'll have a convoy ready this afternoon, prepared to take you anywhere you want to go. Away from all of this, if that's truly what you need." He'd left after that, giving her the morning alone to think, though Aria suspected he already knew what answer he was hopping for. Now, standing at her window with afternoon light slanting through familiar curtains, she watched the convoy arrive exactly as promised. Black SUVs lined her street again, the same sight that had once filled her with terror now settling into something entirely different. These vehicles weren't surrounding her like a threat. They were waiting for her like an invitation. Aria thought about the 4 years she'd spent hiding inside careful routines, convincing herself that safety meant never wanting anything badly enough to risk losing it again. She thought about David, about grief that had calcified into isolation rather than healing into something gentler. She thought about the night she'd pulled bullets from a stranger's body and accidentally pulled herself back into a life she'd forgotten how to want. She stepped outside, and Lucian was already there, standing beside the lead vehicle with the same composed patience he carried into everything, though his eyes betrayed how much this moment actually cost him. "Convoy can take you anywhere," he said. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything that's happened. You don't owe me a different answer just because of what we've shared." "I know I don't owe you anything," Aria said, closing the distance between them. "That's exactly why this choice matters so much. What have you decided?" "I spent 4 years building a life out of fear, convincing myself that surviving was the same thing as living." She held his gaze steadily, the same steadiness she once used over an operating table, except this time it carried something warmer underneath. "I don't want to survive anymore, Lucian. I want to actually live, and somewhere along the way, that started meaning a life with you in it." Something shifted across his face, relief and disbelief tangled together like he hadn't truly allowed himself to hope for this answer. "You understand what that means. My world doesn't simplify just because the war ended." "I didn't fall for a simple life," Aria said. "I fell for you, complications included." Lucian reached for her hand, the gesture careful despite everything they'd survived together. "Then where do you want this convoy to take you?" Aria glanced once more at her quiet house, the clinic down the road, and the careful, colorless life she'd built specifically to avoid feeling anything too deeply ever again. Then she looked at the man standing beside her, scars and empire and all, and finally let herself choose something other than safety. "Take me home," she said. "Wherever that is now, as long as you're in it." Lucian's answer was a smile, rare and unguarded, before he opened the door and let her step into a future she had finally decided to want. If Aria and Lucian's story kept you hooked from the very first SUV to the very last choice, hit that like button before you go. Drop a comment and tell us which part of the story had your heart racing the most. Share this with someone who loves a good Mafia romance, and subscribe so you're here for the next story we tell together. See you in the next one.